Pakistan's history, it's this incredible story of so much promise, but also some really deep, profound challenges. To understand the nation today, you really have to look back at the critical moments that shaped its journey since 1947. So, in this explainer, we're going to dig into the key themes and turning points of its first 7 decades. Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll lay out 5 recurring themes that pretty much define Pakistan's entire story. Then, we'll just walk through its history, from its chaotic birth, through the long years of military rule, the shaky experiments with democracy, and finally, land on the challenges it's facing right now. Before we dive into the timeline, we need a way to make sense of it all, right? A framework. And it turns out you can pretty much understand Pakistan's entire story if you look at it through the lens of these 5. Let's call them persistent challenges. All right, so these are the big 5. First up, you've got this constant political instability, with power just swinging back and forth between civilians and the military. Second, a deep crisis of governance where the state institutions just haven't always worked. Third, a story of economic underachievement, even with some bright spots. Fourth, a national security view that is almost completely obsessed with the threat from India. And finally, the growing and often complicated role of Islam in the state. So keep these 5 ideas in your back pocket because you're going to see them pop up again and again. All right, let's rewind all the way to the beginning. The birth of Pakistan wasn't some peaceful, orderly handover. It was born in fire, really. Just absolute chaos that threw the new nation into crisis from day one. Just look at that number, 14 million. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around, but that's the human scale we're talking about here. The partition of British India set off one of the biggest, most violent migrations in history. Millions of Muslims fled to Pakistan, millions of Hindus and Sikhs fled to India. That trauma, it's just baked into the DNA of the nation. And this just lays out the impossible task facing the founders. I mean, think about it. You have to build a country from the ground up, deal with this massive refugee crisis, and fight a war over Kashmir, all while having only a handful of people who actually knew how to run a government. So right away, they had to make some incredibly tough choices, like, for instance, dedicating 2/3 of the entire budget to the military. That set a precedent that would shape the country for decades to come. And here you go. This slide is just a perfect visual of that first theme we talked about, right? Political instability. After the first prime minister was assassinated, just look at this. It's a total revolving door. 7 prime ministers in 11 years. How do you build anything stable on a foundation like that? So all that political chaos from the first decade, it comes to a screeching halt with the country's first military coup. This kicked off a long period where the country wasn't run by politicians, but by this powerful alliance of the military and the top-tier bureaucracy. And the people who took over, it's useful to think of them as this governing corporation. It wasn't just a general in charge. It was basically a powerful club of top army officers and civil servants who looked at the politicians and said, you know what, we can do this better. And you know what? For a while, it kind of looked like they were right. Under General Ayub Khan, Pakistan went through what a lot of people still call a golden age. The economy took off, huge dams and factories were built, and the country became a real industrial player. But, and this is a huge but, all that progress was built on a really shaky and, frankly, unjust foundation. See, the country was split into 2 parts, West and East Pakistan. And even though most of the people lived in the East, a mind-blowing 80% of all state spending was happening in the West. This created this massive sense of being left out and treated unfairly. Well, as you can imagine, that sense of injustice eventually just boiled over into what was called the 6-point movement. They were basically asking for total control over their own affairs, taxes, trade, everything except for defense and foreign policy. But the government in the West saw it as a threat and just refused to listen. The government in the West just wouldn't budge, and that led to, well, a complete disaster. A political crisis, a brutal military crackdown, a horrific civil war. And finally, with India getting involved, East Pakistan broke away and became Bangladesh. So after losing half the country, after this unbelievable national trauma, the big question was, could civilian rule finally get a real shot? Well, the next 30 years or so were, let's just call it a vicious cycle. You'd see these hopeful democratic beginnings, but they'd quickly get bogged down in bitter political fights. And eventually, the military would step in all over again.
So when you look at the democratic periods, they were pretty much dominated by this intense rivalry between two powerful political families. The Bhuttos, with their Pakistan People's Party, and the Sharifs, with the Pakistan Muslim League. Their constant power struggles often brought the government to a standstill.
And this timeline of the 90s? Wow, it just says it all, doesn't it? This is that political instability theme in neon lights. Election dismissal, over and over until the music stops and the military walks back in. Not a single elected government actually finished its term. Now, in the middle of all that, we have to talk about the long military dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq. His 11 years in power completely changed the country. He pushed this aggressive policy of Islamization that basically hardwired a certain kind of religious extremism into the system. And the consequences of that are something Pakistan is still grappling with today. Okay, May 1998, the number is 6, and that number changed everything. In a direct response to India's nuclear tests, Pakistan conducted 6 of its own. Just like that, it was a declared nuclear power. This cemented the military's power and locked in that fourth theme we talked about, a national security obsession focused squarely on India. All right, that brings us to the modern era, which, you guessed it, kicks off with another military coup in 1999. And in this period, we see Pakistan still fighting with those same old historical problems, but now with a whole new set of massive challenges on top of them. This time, it was General Pervez Musharraf. And his time in power was really defined by one thing: 9/11. Suddenly, Pakistan became this absolutely critical but very complicated ally for the US in the War on Terror. It was this strange balancing act of fighting terrorism on the one hand while trying to manage it at home with a policy he called enlightened moderation. And that brings us to today, where the long-term challenges are, well, they're just staggering. And if you look closely, you can see the ghosts of our 5 themes in every single one of these issues. The endless economic crises, that's the underachievement. The threat from radical groups is a direct legacy of past policies. And things like water scarcity and a booming population just put unbelievable pressure on weak institutions. These are the deep, structural problems that will define its future. But it's not all doom and gloom. Amidst all of these huge challenges, there's a genuinely positive sign. Since 2008, Pakistan has managed something it never had before: more than a decade of continuous democracy, with one civilian government peacefully handing over power to the next. For a country with Pakistan's history, that is a massive deal, a historic first. And so that really leaves us with the big question, the one that will define Pakistan's future. The country has shown that democracy can survive, but can it thrive? Can those democratic institutions finally get strong enough to tackle these deep-rooted problems that have been there since the very beginning? That right there is the central question.